Okay, thanks.
All right, no problem. So I'll get started there. So I know a few of you have been probably to a number of lectures, but for those of you who have not heard this definition, when I talk about medical device, I talk about medical devices as they're defined within the US by the US FDA, which is the regulatory body that controls their marketing and sale within the US. And what is a medical device, depending on what you're looking at, can get a little strange. When it first started out, it was scalpels, x-ray machines. Now we're getting to where we've got 3D printing, we've got biological materials, we've got software, we have combinations of all three, we have drugs impregnated into them. And so it really helps to go back and remember what is a medical device. And even now we have, and I also got to remember, don't forget Apple, Google, and everybody out there putting together wearables, health and wellness products. So my whole career has been primarily medical device. And that is pretty much anything that could be an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent. Some medical devices are liquid. And similar related article, which either is in the National Formulary, it's intended for the use and diagnosis of conditions, cure, mitigation, or prevention of disease, and it's intended to affect the structure of any part of man or animal. So medical devices used on animals are still considered medical devices. So, this was actually the definition. The latest one, as of 2015, was the update. If you have not heard of it before, the FDA has a website. It's fda.gov. And this is where you'll find a lot of resources around what the FDA thinks a medical device is, how it's treated, how they're going to respond to you when you come to them with a new device or invention that you want to be able to sell within the United States. So when we look at all these devices, we realize they all have specific conditions they treat. They're all sold. They're all marketed. They have labels on them that say that they're used a very specific way. But beyond that, there's actually about 1,700 different types of classes of products that are regulated by the FDA. So everything from the CTR machine on the left, upper left, to the $5 oxygen meter that you could have gotten off Amazon, to the 100-year-old stethoscope, to the brand new, ultra small, ultra tiny defibrillators that get implanted in your chest. So what a medical device is, we talk about that. It covers a lot of things. It's really how you use a device and what kind of effect it's supposed to have, and whether or not it's controlled by the FDA. But the second question I always ask students is what they think quality is, because the federal government actually really regulates, besides the sale of a device, when we design them, when we create new devices, has to do with quality. So if you haven't worked in the medical device industry, quality it's a bit of a fuzzy definition. People talk about how nice something is, has it luxurious, what it looks like, what it feels like, whether it's expensive. But when you're actually producing something, if you are flipping over from a consumer side, so you think about high quality a product is, to a producer side. So basically, you're producing high quality products. When you start talking about quality in the manufacturing of things, you're talking about conformance quality. So it's how closely did what's coming off the manufacturing line conform to the actual design that you designed for. So we have actually both of those in medical device. So there is what we call specification quality. So how a medical device performs compared to other devices on the market. If you've heard something called a 510K, a pre-market approval, what a pre-market approval is it's basically saying this is as good as an existing device that had already been approved by the FDA. But we also have what's called conformance quality. So how closely that device was designed, developed, evaluated, and manufactured correctly and reliably. This is something that you absolutely have to provide evidence for continually to be allowed to sell a medical device within the United States. Now notice when I say conformance quality, it's not just the final device itself. It's not just we get to the end of the process, we have a thing, and is the thing correct? The actual process whereby you came to the thing, all the way from your initial inputs to how you tested it, developed it, how you ran your clinical trials, what your submission looked like, and what do you do with it after it's out in the market. All of those have aspects of quality, a way of trying to make sure that you conform to an ideal way of doing them. So that whole thing about correctly and reliably. So it's yes, you conform to a specific ideal of how you design, develop, and manufacture something. And you also do it reliably, meaning whether you're designing something, the thing you want to design is what you get at the end. I've worked at a lot of design teams that what came out at the end and what they talked about at the beginning were two completely different products. Being able to reliably produce something, either by designing the engineering work or the manufacturing along the way you expected to, is a big part of what quality is about. And because of that, this is what I love to show this image to anyone who talks about wanting to work in medical device. The actual thing you see, even if it's just a thermometer, if it's a blood pressure cuff, if it is a mask, if it is a bottle of Tylenol, whatever it is, what it takes to actually make that thing, you have to think of it at least as an order of magnitude bigger. The documentation, the factories, the resources, the trained individuals, the records, all the things that are involved in making sure that thing is safe and effective. And you're going to have to stop me for a moment because apparently I have a timer on my lighting and I need to go get up and wave my arms around for a second to get the light to come back on. So excuse me a moment. Oh, nope. Okay, all I have to do is move my chair around.
Perfect.
All right, and the light is back on. I did mention earlier, I am in a brand new building. And so apparently it has every single environmental doodah and efficiency mode in the world. And so yes, if apparently I don't gesture broadly enough, it is going to turn the lights off on me. Or if I start over gesturing, you'll know I'm trying to keep the lights on. So, takeaway message here, thinking about it's not just the device. It's not just the thing you hold in your hand. This is one of the biggest things that I try to convey to students who are just getting into what it takes to actually design, develop, and manufacture a device. Is everything on the back end, everything that happens inside the medical device company is so much larger and more complex than what the actual thing coming out is. And this is actually a good thing because especially our modern considerations of medical device, we are used to working with technology that 99.999% of the time, it works exactly as intended. That we know exactly what's in the bottle, and if we take a medication for a particular condition, it does exactly what we planned it to. That is all by the effort of a lot of very hardworking people to make that happen. Every Band-Aid you open and you put on a cut, the fact that it's sterile, that it doesn't infect your skin, that it doesn't cause a rash, the fact that every single one, and the fact that it only costs a cent or two, that is all very intentional and involves a lot of detailed work. So part of that is if you are a medical device company, you have something that is called a QMS, a quality management system. So this is something that is mandated by federal law. If you are creating a class 2 or class 3 product, you must have a system for ensuring that your design, your materials, any changes you make, your equipment, your document, your change controls, all of these follow a high level of quality. They're consistent, they're reliable. So a quality management system is a collection of business processes, organizational governance, structure, policies, procedures, and the resources needed to ensure quality. And when I talk about design controls is the very specific aspect of a QMS system that has to do with how you design and develop a new medical device. It's only part of it. So if all you do is design, that's not enough to be a medical device company. Every medical device company has to have all of these components if you are manufacturing a medical device for sale within the United States. So diving a little bit about to control, because I say design, most people will have their own idea of what design means, but control is a specific concept. Like medical device, it's kind of easy to define, but it actually looks like many different things. Basically, it's a mechanism to ensure that a part of a process is completed the same way, same results every time. There are a lot of things in medical device processes that are like recipes. If you want to make chocolate chip cookies, the recipe is actually very straightforward. However, to get the same batch of cookies over and over again, you are going to need a whole number of controls, whether it's a control over how much you mix the dough, your measurement controls, timing, temperature, all the different parameters that can affect the output product. You have to have different mechanisms in place to decide how you control it. So, not always easy to see in medical device, but it's pretty easy to know when something is controlled versus uncontrolled. If you and your roommate go out and you take the same recipe and you both decide to make a batch of cookies, and one person looks like the cookies on the left and one has cookies that look on the right, the difference is not in the recipe. It's in the controls of the recipe. It could be the temperature. Did you put on the top rack or the bottom rack? Could be in the ingredients. Did you use, what kind of butter did you use? Did it have salt? No salt? Your measurement tools, the precision of the measurement. The tools, did you use a whisk or a spoon? Then technique, time, humidity, training. There's so many potential parameters that you could spend your entire life coming up with all the controls, come up with the perfect chocolate chip cookie. In fact, it actually does occur in a lot of the food industry. Large fast food chains, franchises where everyone you walk into, the food tastes exactly the same. The only way it's that way is because they have perfected all of the controls that come around preparing food in each one of those places. So there are controls throughout the QMS system. So for example, material controls. Once you actually start creating and making things, you have to understand where they came from, the flow of things as they're being assembled, the control that comes, the control of the finished goods before it's shipped out. Material controls can actually consist of physical cages, racks, locked rooms. But then you have design controls, which is more having to do with just the processes. It's how your engineers do the work. Change controls can be how change happens. It can happen to your manufacturing, your testing. If you make a design change after the device is on the market, it could be how you change a policy or a document within your QMS. You have document control. So every document, every piece of paper within a medical device company actually has a very specific format. Their names stored, updated, tracked. Some of these documents have very specific names. Then we have equipment facility controls. So very important if you are a major manufacturer and you have large pieces of equipment. For example, if you are a medical device sterilization house, you need to make sure that your equipment, whether it's a gamma irradiation, whether it's ethylene oxide sterilization, all of those major pieces of equipment have vital controls on them that ensure the product is sterilized appropriately. You also have something that's called a CAPA, corrective and preventative actions. So this is the process for resolving quality issues. Every time you need to make a change, every time something goes wrong out in the field, a device breaks, you find out afterward the wrong material was put in a product, the wrong label was put on. CAPAs are the way that you control how you respond and manage those kinds of things. And then finally in the middle, you may not know this, but if you're new to the medical device world, because medical devices are controlled by federal law, there is a very clear legal responsibility among medical device manufacturers. That, in fact, goes directly to the top. So a key part of a QMS system actually involves management. My husband was a quality engineer for about 15 years, and one of his most regular duties was having a monthly executive meeting. And the whole purpose of that meeting was to present everything that was going on concerned with quality within the entire company. So if they had material that wasn't coming in right, if they had complaints from the field saying a device had broken, if there had to be some major change to the labeling, his whole job was to make sure that the executives knew it. And that was because in medical devices, the management is directly legally liable for anything that happens due to the medical device manufacturing company. Now, the next question I usually get asked is, once you know what a quality management system is who actually needs one? So there are a lot of manufacturing companies, service providers, material suppliers in the medical device industry that don't need a QMS, a quality management system by federal law. So this applies to finished device manufacturers. So these are the ones who are directly responsible for producing the final device and ensuring it's functional, it's safe, it's effective before it goes out to patients. So you have to be a finished device manufacturer. If you are a contract manufacturer who just makes part of the device, if you just do one of the processes on it, if you're a contractor, you may not need a QMS, but however, your client will probably feel a lot better if you do. So a finished device is defined as any device or accessory that is suitable for use or capable of functioning. So whether or not it's packaged, labeled, sterilized, once you start making the last part of the thing, even if it doesn't have a label on it, even if it's not packaged, if it's possible for someone to take that device and try and use it, then you are considered a finished device manufacturer. So there are always exemptions, certain types of medical device. So certain classes of medical device, they've been around so long, they're considered so low risk that the additional cost of demanding a QMS system is actually, counter to the goal of having cheap, available, safe medical devices. So there's a few devices that you're exempt by law. An exemption from GMP requirements, it does not exempt manufacturers from finished devices from keeping complaint or general requirement forms. So even if you are dealing with a device that doesn't necessarily need a QMS system, you still have to have a registration site with the FDA, and you need to be able to document complaints. So you mentioned before the thing about CAPAs, corrective and preventative actions. So even if you are exempt for various reasons from all the other parts of that QMS system, there still has to be a way for you to complain and let people know that something is not right with your product. And now, once you figure out, okay, what is a quality management system? Who needs one? When do you need a QMS? So I've built almost my entire career around startups. And this is actually a really critical question, because setting up that documentation, getting the kind of talent and the skills that you need to be able to do that correctly, filling out all those forms, it's an insane amount of work. And it's only appropriate once you get to a certain amount of design readiness. So this is probably a similar diagram to what you may have seen some of the other lecturers use. There's an overall process in creating new devices. Usually there's some kind of an idea, an early discovery. You do kind of a prototyping and developing it. You do a few studies. You do some bench testing. Eventually it gets refined enough to the point that you get comfortable using it on a person. And then you use all that data as part of a regulatory submission before you can sell it, proving to the FDA that the device is safe and it does what you say it does. Then you launch it. And even after you launch, you still have additional responsibilities as a medical device manufacturer that you potentially have to report back to the FDA. So when do you need quality processes? You actually need them pretty much the entire time. The question is, which of those quality processes do you actually need? For example, CAPAs, corrective and preventative actions. If you don't have a medical device being used by patients out on the market, you don't necessarily need an active CAPA form. Same thing with equipment controls and material controls. Unless you're creating a batch of validated product that you're specifically using for a major clinical study or an engineering validation, you don't necessarily need those. So you go back and you go down this list when you get all the way back to the very, very beginning of when you have that first idea, you're first figuring out what it is you want to build. There's really two things that are there. There's management. There's somebody who ultimately is the CEO and ultimately responsible for the design and development. And there's design controls. Design controls are one of the only parts of all the multi-part QMS system that needs to really start being in place from the very beginning. So it's one of the things I say is the most important thing for you to learn as a biomedical engineer, especially if you want to work on new designs, new products, is to understand design controls. You may never have to write a CAPA. You may never have to do an incoming calibration report for a new piece of capital equipment, but you should know the basics of design control. So why do we need them? Well, design is a process. And like we just heard, every process, you can have controls to ensure that process gets what you want at the end. So if you want to make sure your design is consistent, if it has a desired outcome, you need to have controls. The other change is a little bit of regulatory history. So prior to being added to 21 CFR, so that's section 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, there were a large number of device recalls that were attributed directly to poor control of the design and development practices. So these were cases where you would have a medical device that had gotten enough data to get FDA approval, regulatory oversight, but then once it went from the first 100 patients to 100,000 patients or 1 million patients, suddenly every failure, every risk they hadn't identified, every potential user situation they hadn't understood very clearly started coming out, and they started seeing all these recalls due to these unforeseen circumstances. And in fact, it wasn't necessarily that they were unforeseen, it was just they hadn't been designed correctly. They hadn't used the correct level of practices in doing their design. So this is really, design controls is where you've taken the quality idea from quality control, which is very old school. You go back to the earliest people talking about quality engineering. It's all about making sure every part coming off a manufacturing line is identical. But nowadays, design control is part of what's called quality assurance. You are designing the quality into the device. The focus is on what happens at the end. So instead of waiting at the end and going like, okay, you just have like, it's like having a class where you only have one final exam. The student fails the final exam. Okay, it doesn't work. What you're doing here is from the very beginning, you start training your students to the test. You identify what they need to pass. And bit by bit, you build them up to where they have exactly what they need to pass the final. It actually makes really great business sense as well. A lot of the shortcuts that are being made early on in design to try and keep things lean, to do things quickly, actually end up having to be work that has to be completely redone at the end.
We have a question in the chat asking, how do changes to FDA rules affect this process?
Okay, so we'll get to that in a little bit. So there's a couple of ways that changes happen. So there's the big federal rules, so the actual federal law, and that is called the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. We'll get to that in a minute. Then there are the guidelines the FDA puts out. So the FDA has to implement the law. That's part of their job as a government agency. But if once you look at those rules, the federal laws are actually very short. The whole of CFR Section 21 is maybe 4 or 5 pages. And so they're given a lot of bandwidth in how they choose to interpret those laws. So when they come up with new requirements, new programs, it tends to happen very, very slowly over time. And it tends to, and so usually it happens with the guidelines first. So there's what's mandated by federal law. There is general guidelines that the FDA will put out to say, hey, this is how you should do it. And then there's just the individual processes, like this is the portal that you have to upload the documents to, or these are the different kinds of proof that we will ask for based on the risk of your device. And that's a lot more fluid. So all of these things can change. It's just the time span over which you may be asked to change, evolve. Sometimes they change very quickly, like during COVID era, when they were actually trying to rapidly get certain COVID tests, they changed a bunch of policies, but it was an emergency condition. And now they're kind of dialing back and going back and reevaluating some of what they did. So keep asking the questions. And Robbie, go ahead and let me know if you see a chat there. I'm trying to, so let me know if anyone else comes up with things, okay?
Yep, I will do so. And as for time check, it is 4 o'clock, so we have 30 minutes left.
All right, good to know. Okay, so talking about all the parts of the QMS system, that's the little snowflake. There's actually 9 different parts of design controls. I'm not going to be able to go into all of these in detail, but if someone talks to you about design controls, especially if they talk about ISO 13485, quality management systems, and they talk about design controls and the sections that are in the federal law, generally it will come down to 9 big points, and that's what these different pieces are. Okay, and just like the quality management system, which thing you need to control changes as you go from the very beginning to the very end. So I said before, you do need to have design controls from the very, very beginning, but you don't need a whole lot of paperwork. There's 2 things you really need. One, you will have some paperwork. So documentation, it will exist forever in medical device. It starts from the very beginning and goes to the very end. But some of the clearest thing you need to understand is just design input. Everyone knows that you have a certain level of requirements that you need to engineer a product to meet, but you have to think even further back and go, where did those requirements come from? And so one of the requirements that first came up when design control was being developed was, where are your inputs? When you say that a knee implant needs to be able to support so many pounds of force, where did that come from? Was it testing? Was it a scientific review journal? Was it something just your orthopedic surgeon said you needed? And being able to track that to specific outputs. So next stage after you get the initial inputs is a lot of times design planning. You actually have to make a plan on how you do the design, what resources, what skills you need, what big chunks of work will you need to lay out. You have key decision points throughout your design process that are called design review, where you are bringing together multiple people to make what we call go, no-go decisions, to provide input, feedback into the overall process. And then you start producing output. Design output is simply the things, the tangible things, the prototypes, the papers, the diagrams, the CAD drawings and software. And then you enter into design verification and validation, which is making sure you did things and then making sure you did it, you met the original problem that you were trying to solve. And then you get to design transfer, which is the whole process of going from, okay, I'm a designer, we're designing something, we're creating the design, to manufacture. We are now going to throw that design over to someone who is going to make the physical thing, and the design has to stop. The design work stops. And then even at that point, when you do need to make a change, you get an adverse event, you get some kind of feedback, you have to find a new supplier, you have to change something about the design, that part continues to be controlled. So from the very beginning to the very end, there are parts of the process that you are documenting, recording, and providing specific types of information and activities. So what do design control failures look like? So sometimes you will find a lot of things, recalls in the news, where they will talk about a pacemaker failed or a pump failed. There can be a lot of mechanical failures. Sometimes these are due to suppliers. Sometimes it was a manufacturing problem. A lot of recalls are just labeling issues. But there's a lot of issues that they realized in the 90s were not, what they thought was a user issue or a manufacturing issue was something that if they had just followed a process a little more closely, they would have designed around it initially. So this is what they found October 1983 and 89, 44% of voluntary recalls. So this is voluntary, meaning the manufacturer themselves called up the FDA and said, we have a problem and we need to have all these products back because they don't work. So those may have been presented by adequate design controls. Inputs, outputs, verification, validation, transfer, tracking design changes. And the most frequent causes for recalls are related to design, software, and non-conforming material components. So this was even, when they're looking at all those different recalls. So design, primarily working with hardware, software, failure to update, failure to account for future forward and backward facing interfaces, and finally non-conforming materials components, which is usually where you see the manufacturing failures. So failures can occur throughout the entire design process, where when you're thinking about it. So one of the things, so I have a couple of case studies here I want to talk about. I don't know if you've heard of something called the Therac 25. The Therac 25, at its time in the 1980s, was the most advanced form of radiation therapy you could receive. So it actually had a computer. In fact, the Therac 25 was actually the third or fifth version of this piece of equipment. Now, the problem is when they sat down to design the Therac 25, after doing the Therac 10, the Therac 20, they decided to reuse some of the software code. At the time, software components of medical devices were not very carefully regulated. We didn't really understand how you update them, what the potential risk could be. Mostly they were just being used for data. Unfortunately, in this situation, what the Therac 25 software actually controlled was there was a small guarding cover that covered the radiation source. And so what they discovered is that a couple of technicians, when they went back and forth on the keys, the cover was getting stuck open. The tech would then do a couple of test fires to make sure the equipment was operating, but at the same time, they were literally test firing and giving patients a full dose of radiation. Some patients were receiving 5 or 6 times their therapeutic dose during these test fires. And unfortunately, there were no flags. There were no workarounds. Obviously, they were just looking at a black and white screen of text data. There was no confirmation or even information that radiation had been emitted. And so it wasn't until patients started developing extreme radiation burns that they realized they had to go back and they found the bug in the code. This was actually the premier example that actually pushed a lot of modern software development quality systems. How often you have to check it, how you have to update it, and how you make sure before you integrate it into your medical device. Other kind of design control failures, some failures you're going to see is because we're going to be constantly dealing with new situations that previous versions of technology may not have dealt with. So for example, the introduction of wireless insulin pumps. Great idea. Let's put a Bluetooth connector inside a wireless insulin pump and use it so you don't have to have a bunch of wires hanging off a patient. Bad news is the concept of cybersecurity didn't even exist. There were a number of very high-profile cases around this time about people talking about hacking insulin pumps, that there was no security on the signal that allowed you to communicate with your insulin pump. And so this was literally the product that kicked off the whole looking at cybersecurity. Now, design guidelines are still in development. It was just this last year, I think 2023, 2024, that the FDA is now going to start mandating cybersecurity elements in any wireless medical device that goes under review. The design control failures. Theranos. Really good book. Bad Blood talks about the Theranos in Silicon Valley. And what they were working on, or they claimed to be developing, a very high precision multi-test diagnostic that could be run off of a small drop of blood. At the time, there was a lot of back and forth about whether this would be considered a lab test in a lab versus a medical device, something that's still being argued back and forth today. So if they were a medical device, then they should have gone through what was called design review. Design review is where you systematically collect a group and you present the current state of design at critical points, and you get feedback from the executive team, from regulatory, from quality, from the engineer, as well as potentially third parties. And the whole concept here is to have a very clear and transparent idea of the state of the technology, what risks it has, and how well that technology interacts with other parts of the business. If you read Bad Blood, you'll find one of the things that Theranos did is they didn't have any any experts really in the medical device process in on their reviews. They had a number of very high, big name people on the board, but no one who actually knew anything about blood diagnostics. And when every design, they actually had multiple redundant design groups that were pitted against each other. And so they didn't talk about the state of the technology. Everyone assumed the technology was a lot more advanced than it was. You know, if they had been following a QMS system with actual formal design reviews, this was something that would never have happened. Other major failure, 2015, superbug infections due to endoscopes. So this is a case of design verification. So this idea of as you're developing your design, you should be doing all kinds of tests, figuring out, okay, is it strong enough? What happens when we wash it? What happens when we sterilize it? To make sure it's still performing the way you expect it to. An endoscope is a reused device. It's a device that, after it's been used on one patient, undergoes a whole cleaning and sterilization protocol to make sure it's safe to be used on the other. Devices like this, you actually have to submit your cleaning protocol with your original FDA designation to be able to get the indication of use for reuse. The problem was they did all their cleaning tests on brand new products. What happened over time, like any device that has some plastic components, is some of the plastic started to shrink. You started getting very tiny cracks and crevices in places where you started having material that didn't get fully cleaned when using the cleaning protocol developed on a brand new device. Those aged devices were not getting fully clean. And as such, unfortunately, you were getting infection spread. Other kind of design failures, just effects that you did not realize, sometimes even small changes. So these were breast implants, and there are currently no textured implants on the market because of this product. What happened is they had certain types of breast implants were actually being moved around after implantation. The engineers decided, let's put a little bit of texture. It'll help some of the tissue fibers to grow into the implant. It'll help it stay in place, keep it from moving around. Unfortunately, what they didn't realize is they were causing those mechanical changes were having a biochemical effect, such that the risks of cancers in these women was 6 times higher than that of women who did not have the implants. So currently, no textured implants have been approved by the FDA for use on the market because this effect that they did not catch during design validation. So again, this was on the market. Large numbers of women had had these implants, the breast implants used in them. It wasn't until they got to the scale and they started tracking the cancer, this was an effect they didn't catch in validation. Finally, design control failures, warning letters, 483s. You can actually go on FDA.gov, look at one of their databases, and you can actually find warning letters to all the existing medical device manufacturers because of different failures of audits that they may have had. But in this case, this was medical at Smith's Medical, located at Minneapolis, Minnesota. This was when the auditor came and actually visited the site. They said, okay, hey, we want to look at your documentation. And unfortunately, they showed up and literally said, your firm failed or refused to furnish materials or information respecting the device that is required under this act and code. Basically, they showed up and said, we need to look at your documentation. And they said, we're not showing it to you, or we can't show it to you. What they had is they actually did not have a document system that they were able to show to the auditors. And so they received the warning letters. If they don't respond, if they don't take corrective action and demonstrate that they actually did have those documents available, they would be shut down by the FDA. So additional resources you can check out. So I will send these links later to Robbie afterward. But if you want to look at the warning letters, the allergen breast implant recall, all of these are very well studied case studies that actually give you a lot of insight as to how the design process can break down. Even when you have amazing ideas, even when it seems like a very small change, that it still can have incredibly impact on patients at the far end. So Robbie, where are we time-wise?
Yeah, it's 4:14, so we have about 15 minutes left.
Okay, so the question earlier you had about laws, standards, guidances around design controls. This is where I want to talk a little bit more about it. So basically, Food and Drug Administration, FDA, it's part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Their entire job is to implement the federal laws that are responsible for taking care of a wide variety of different products that the public uses. So they're responsible for protecting public health, and they do that by making sure it's safe, effective, and secure. They cover drugs, vaccines, biological products, medical devices, including a number of products that are radiation emitting, but are not actually technically medical devices. So FDA has been developed long-term over about a century of time. So sometimes they get weird hodgepodges of groups that are smashed together, but they're broadly appropriate for a lot of life science-based products. In medical devices, this is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH. So if it is an actual medical device, according to the FDA definition, this is the group that is actually going to be responsible for reviewing and determining whether or not your new medical device is safe. So all of these activities were established by federal law. Now, federal law, generally every 10 to 20 years, a new major federal law is passed that fundamentally changes some of FDA's abilities. FDA, when they first started off in the initial agency before it was called FDA, the first was around 1906. They actually had very minimal ability to do anything. They were able to investigate deaths. They were able to notify the public if bad things were happening, but they didn't have a lot of legal ability to do anything about it. 1938 was one of the first times they actually got some legal power to do anything. This is when they came up with inspectors. And so instead of waiting until somebody died or someone got seriously hurt, they were actually able to say, hey, this is a food, a drug item, a cosmetic, and because of that, we have the right to come in and inspect your factory. The state of food factories prior to 1938 was in some ways horrible. Cosmetic Act, there were a number of cosmetics, especially pre-1930s, containing lead materials. There was a very popular eyelash dye that blinded literally hundreds of young women. All of these, there was no law that prevented them from being sold until the FDA came along. Medical Device Amendments to the FD&C Act, 1976. 1976 is actually a major date in the medical device world. So prior to 1976, drugs had to be reviewed by the FDA before they could be sold, but medical devices did not. Medical devices were considered simple things. There's like a scalpel, this is a cast, this is a brace, but by 1976, we were getting to some very advanced technologies. We had the first pacemakers in the 1960s. We had x-rays. We had heart-lung machines that were looking at taking over also in the late 50s, 1960s. And so this is when the FDA realized, we need to start controlling these and reviewing these before they're allowed to be sold. So this was where a right to review, so where you had to have pre-market approval, came from, starting in 1976. And then even in 1990, this is where auditing the design process, because in 1976, they said, hey, you need to apply to us to approve. What they just sent them was the final design. They didn't have to actually go back even further and say, well, did you design it the right way? They had to come in and just say, well, this is what it is. So 1990 is when they came back and said, we now have the right to audit the design process. So you now have to have a design history file. You have to document how it was designed, not just the final design. And so where the laws that that's covered by, that's the Code of Federal Regulations. If you've never read it, I highly recommend checking it out. Just look up Code of Federal Regulations. It's online, and there's an electronic online. And really, it is all the general and permanent rules that the U.S. covers the state. And so there's 50 different titles. Title 3 covers everything about the president. Title 14, aeronautics and space. Is it illegal to shoot off a rocket in the middle of the U.S.? Check out Title 14. Also covers things like employees. Title 21 is food and drugs. Everything that covers what the federal government mandates about food and drugs is in Title 21. And if you break this down, it's broken down by title, chapter, subchapter, parts, and sections. And so if you're looking at where design controls is, all the way on the bottom, it's part of the quality system regulation, which is under subchapter H, all medical devices, about 608 pages total. And then you have chapter 1, which is Food and Drug Administration, Department of Health and Human. Everything the FDA does is in parts 1 through 1299. And this is what it looks like if you go onto it. So if you look at 21 CFR 820.3, subpart C, design controls, this is literally the federal law, as you read it, about what you need for design controls. And this says, each manufacturer of any class 3 or class 2 device and class 1 devices listed in paragraph A2. So it says this, and a couple of exclusions, shall establish and maintain procedures to control the design of the device in order to ensure that specified design requirements are met. So, class 2 or class 3 devices have to have design controls. As general, this goes on for a little ways and gives you a few more details about what those look like. And it also talks about the device classification. So, I may not have heard this before, but class 1 to class 3. In the US, we have a 3-part system. Parts of Europe, they actually have a 4-part system. It's a class 1, class 2, AB, and then a class 3. And a lot of what you see in what we call regulated medical device falls under class 2. Class 3 is pacemakers, artificial hearts. Class 2 is where you get into more thermometers, surgical tools, a lot of just general tools where you need to have some controls. You need to prove it's safe and effective, but it's not quite, if it fails, it won't kill somebody. So usually it talks about you need general controls, special controls. Even class 1, you need to have some basic controls that are good for manufacturing. So they're not a potential risk, but you still want to make sure that they're designed appropriately and they meet their specifications. General controls, once you add special controls, that's where you get into, okay, do you have to have a calibration? Do you have to check they're measuring things correctly? Are there sharp edges? Are there potential ways that this could really hurt somebody? And do you have ways to mitigate that? And then class 3, you not only have general controls and special controls, you have additional potential controls that are part of the FDA approval. Now, that is completely different from industry standards. So we've talked about what the FDA does, what the federal law is, and then industry standards. Industry standards were developed by industry specifically to find a way for large, complex things to work together. They're a relatively modern invention. ASTM and IEC, so that's Society of Testing Materials, they got started when we tried to build an intercontinental railroad. They were like, look, if we're going to put this many railroad systems across something as huge as the United States, we actually have to have all the same track sizes. It was one of the very first challenges that the ASTM was formed. Since then, they've gone for, every time we come up with a new technology where we've had to test it, we've had to figure out what material to use in a medical device, ASTM is there working on standards. I'm actually part of ASTM's group F42, which is in charge of 3D printing of medical devices. How do you do quality tests on titanium hip implants? So those kinds of standards. International Electrotechnical Commission, if you work on anything with a battery, you are going to run into IEC 6601, which is electrical safety for medical devices. And then finally, you have ISO. ISO is a worldwide organization. It got launched post-World War II as people were trying to work internationally across different country lines to be able to work together on different products. And so they have a number of very important things on biocompatibility, as well as ISO 13485, the quality management system. So remember, this is a standard. I talked about Code of Federal Regulations. It's actually been a gradual process of convergence to make sure that things like the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, actually has a similar structure to what the ISO says about quality systems. They both have mandates about you must have a quality management system. Now the FDA says you must have a quality management system, you must meet the Code of Federal Regulations, but by the way, if you meet the ISO standard, you also meet the quality standard for the federal law. So it's actually split into 8 different sections, talks about scope, terms and definitions, very, very important in quality systems. Talked about management responsibility, so who is responsible for what resource. It's a lot of very specific details, but also how do you build up the overall structure. And finally, there's guidance. Guidances are not law. Usually they come out after there's been a brand new technology or a technology that's been heavily misunderstood or has been a lot of public interest around. And the FDA has already approved a dozen or so products. And now, based on what they've learned about reviewing the safety, the risk of those new types of products, they'll create a guidance to basically make it easier for additional businesses to come in and do new submissions for similar type products. So every time you have a major issue, so for example, they put a guidance out when we had those endoscopic challenges where they had cleaning protocols. They had a number of guidances out about the reuse of PPE in COVID era. They had a guidance that came out in when we were looking at doing 3D printing in medical devices. And you can still find all these guidances online on their FDA.gov website. It's not law. You can't hold the FDA for or against anything you find in those guidances, but it will greatly improve your odds of getting through and getting an approval if you follow those guidances. So best practices, a lot of what we do in quality management systems, in controls, in how you design in medical device, we've actually borrowed very heavily from aerospace and a lot of other applications where we've had to have things like Six Sigma or lean manufacturing or just in time. There's a lot of tools and trends that times can become more popular. And so if you're going to work in the field and you really want to work as a quality engineer, it's good to, sometimes people ask me like, hey, should I get my Six Sigma black belt? Should I get trained in design for manufacturing, design for sustainability, or lean manufacturing technology? It really depends on where you want to work. A lot of these tools and trends were adopted and developed by very large companies. If you want to work for Boston Sci, if you want to work for Medtronic, they have their own specific system that they have in-house that you likely will get trained on. There's also a large industry group called the American Society for Quality, ASQ. You can get ASQ certified as a certified quality engineer. So if there's an area you want to go into, that's something you can look into as a way of developing out your job. Again, it's not necessarily hard, but it's a lot of statistics. It's a lot of very specific knowledge about how to run experiments and, again, ensure you have a control of your process, your input and your outputs are matching. But again, it's something if you want to work onto it, ASQ, they also have a website online. So talking about these three things, talking about design controls in the federal law, design controls in ISO, which is an international standard organization, and then the FDA guidances. These are the three main areas where you're going to find information on how to do design controls. So the Code of Federal Regulations, ISO 1345, and a document that's still up. The latest document was from 1997. It's a PDF you can download from the FDA website that talks through design controls, inputs, outputs, reviews, verification, validation, transfer, and all those elements. And as you can see, this has actually slowly converged over time. This nice parallel path between 21 CFR 820 and ISO 1345 did not exist more than 10 years ago. There's been a lot of careful redesign such that it tends to follow the same level. So it's easy to be compliant in both systems. And then again, the FDA guidance, this is a very word-heavy document. It's not too long. It's about 16 pages. It provides a lot of just good general overview, examples about how you would implement some of the very small, thin-lined line items that are listed in ISO and 21 CFR. And so this is where I try to take away people when we're talking about, well, what does the FDA mandate? It's like, well, there's the federal law. It's like, does it meet the law? It sets up the organizational structure you have to have, the lines of responsibility,
I'm
processes.
checked. We are at 427.
Okay, I'm just about done here.
Got it.
So just saying here on design controls, it's covered by the federal law, the standards, the guidances, and the best practices. So as far as legally what you have to do, that's on the left. High level, it's mandatory, but especially if you're starting out and you've never done this before, it's not going to exactly tell you a lot about how you actually do your job every day at a medical device company. If you go all the way to the right, if you go to a trade show, if you start looking at journal publications, if you go to the Greenlight Guru blog, which I highly recommend, they do a lot of great stuff on quality systems. These are all industry best practices. They'll provide you a lot of detail, but again, it's optional, which means it may not always apply to the specific type of technology you're working with. And that's it. So I guess I called a time check, 10 minutes for Q&A.
Sorry, we're actually supposed to wrap up at 4:30, but I mean, it's a little flexible depending on how long people can hang around for, so.
Okay, I'm sorry. What time is it?
Oh, it's
Oh, what?
4:28.
Okay, well then 2 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, I mean
Thank
two
you.
minutes plus however long people want to stick around for.
Okay, and if you guys have questions or just want to reach out to me later, this is my LinkedIn information. There's a lot of Kate Stephensons on LinkedIn, so Dyad Engineering is actually the best way to find me directly.
Yeah, apparently there's a Kate Stephenson who's a musician. I was searching to get your picture and I had to search for a dyad.
That's okay. There's also a French literature professor, I think in somewhere in the southern United States, who's
All right.
heavily published.
Glad I didn't get her for this talk.
Nope, not a musician, not a French literature professor.
All right. Any quick questions? You can either call out or put them in the chat. Anybody? We have one person say that was a lot of helpful info. Thank you.
All right. Glad to hear it. I know it's a lot of information. I will see. So, Robbie, I think I sent you the PDF. If you want to go ahead and share that with the attendees today to follow up and look at some of the information.
Sure. Yeah,
I
did you
mean,
make any changes after you sent it to me, or is that the
no.
latest version? Okay,
So,
great.
yeah.
Yeah, so I'll also be putting this recording online, and I will send out the slides to the mailing list.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right. Thanks everyone for being here. Next week, regular time, 3 p.m., we have Portia Singh talking about how to refine your design, which is supposed to be the follow-up to the prototyping talk from 2 weeks ago. So thanks again, Dr. Stephenson, and I will see everyone later.
All right. Have a great week.